In this part of episode 2, we're going to be talking about addition of integers. So, the addition symbol, we remember, was the plus sign. And so if you want to add two numbers together, all that you have to do is put the plus sign between them, and this is the symbolic notation for add 2 and 3. Now, if you want to add maybe a positive number and a negative number, then you could write something like -4 plus 5. And this would represent add -4 and 5 in symbols. Or you could put the -4 in the back. However, if you put the -4 in the back, it's kind of messy to have the plus sign and the negative symbol right next to each other. So in a situation like this, we will put parentheses around the negative number just to make it a little bit less messy and separate the plus sign from the negative sign. It's also possible to add a negative number to another negative number, right? So I could also say something like -6 plus -8. But again, what we've written here is kind of messy. We don't like to have the plus sign directly next to the negative sign. So in a situation like this, we do separate those symbols. We use a parentheses to separate those symbols to make it a little bit less messy. So now that we've talked about how we write down addition of integers in symbols, let's talk a little bit about how we add integers together. How do we do addition when we have some negative numbers and some positive numbers in our addition? There are a bunch of different ways to add integers together. So let's talk about that. The first way to add integers together is to use a number line. And if you're using a number line to add integers together, I can demonstrate to you the process with, for example, 3 plus -4. To add 3 and -4 on a number line and figure out what the result of that would be, I would start at the number line at 3, and then because I'm adding a negative number, I would move left on the number line 4 paces. So for example, if I draw my number line, here is 0, and a little bit in the warm direction is 3. If I go and start at 3 and move 1, 2, 3, 4 paces to the left, then I end up at the location of -1. And this -1 that I've got my moving left 4 paces would be the result of this addition. To add a negative number, you just move to the left along the number line, as opposed to when you're adding a positive number, where you move to the right along the number line. Now let's think about this from the perspective of temperature, or better yet, let's think about this from the perspective of money. If you were adding a positive amount of money to your financial status, if you're adding, for example, savings, then if you're adding savings, in the end, your financial situation should be better than it was before, because savings is a good thing, right? So if you're adding a positive number, if you're adding, for example, savings, your result should be larger than what you had before. Your result should be better than what it was before if you add savings. Whereas if you add a negative number, that's kind of like if you're adding a new debt. If you're adding extra debt, then overall your financial status is worse than it was before, right? You're more in debt than you were before, so your financial status is worse. And so if you add a debt, if you add a negative number, your financial status is worse. And that is the same kind of situation that you get if you go left along the number line. You go into more negative territory as you move to the left. So for a couple more examples of calculating addition with negative numbers, suppose that I said, what is negative 5 plus 2? So here I'm starting out financially in debt with a financial status represented by -5. And then I add a little bit of savings to pay off some of that debt. And now the question is, what's my financial status now? It's a little bit better than it was before, right? I didn't get quite enough money to pay off my entire debt, but at least I don't have as much debt now as I had before. If I start with 5 units of debt, 5 units of debt, and I get 2 units of extra income from that, and I go 2 units in the positive direction, 2 units to the right, now I find myself at a location -3. So -3 would be the result of this addition. I'm still in debt, but I'm not as in debt as I was before. Or if someone says to me, what is -7 plus -2? Okay, I'm in a bad situation here, right? Because I'm already in debt in this problem. I'm starting in debt, 7 units in debt, but now I'm taking on and I'm adding additional debt to what I already have. So I'm expecting to get a final result where I'm even more in debt than I started with. So if I draw this on a number line, here's a 0 somewhere over here maybe. And then as I move to the left, I'm more and more negative. The numbers are getting colder and colder. And if I start with -7 units of debt, and then I take on an additional 2 units of debt, then I go even further into the negative direction. And I find myself with lots of debt now, -9 units of debt. So -9 would be the result of this addition. Now, another common way to add negative numbers is to use tiles or objects, and to use some tiles that represent positive objects and to use some tiles that represent negative objects. For example, suppose that I wanted to represent adding together -4 and -2. So I'm already in debt, but now I am adding an additional debt of 2 units. So I'm going to be worse off than I was before. In a situation like this, one way to represent this problem is to use a token, for example, a red square, to represent the negative numbers in this situation. So I have 4 red squares to represent my initial debt of 4 units. And then I have another pile of 2 red squares to represent the additional debt I'm taking on. And if I put those piles together, then in total I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 negative tokens here. In total, the result of this addition would be negative 6 units. And that makes sense. If I'm already in a little bit of debt and then I take on additional debt, then I'm going to end up even worse than when I started, with negative 6 units representing my debt. Now, what if I had instead 3 plus negative 2? If I wanted to calculate 3 plus negative 2 using tiles, how would I do that? So in this situation, I would have a pile of, say, 2 red squares. And this pile of 2 red squares would represent these 2 units of debt that I am adding on to my financial status. And then somewhere else, I would have a pile of a different object, blue circles. 3 blue circles to represent these 3 positive units, and 2 red squares to represent these 2 negative units. Now, when I'm adding, I put these piles together, right? But when you're dealing with a pile that contains both negative and positive objects, negative and positive together cancel each other out. So whenever a positive object and a negative object join together in the same pile, they cancel each other and delete each other. And that leaves me with just one blue circle representing one positive object, giving me a result of positive 1. And that makes sense, because if I started with 3 units of savings and then I took on 2 units of debt, then overall, if I use some of that savings to pay off this bill, I've now got less savings than I had before, right? So if I originally had 3 units of savings, I spent part of it to pay this bill. Now I'm down to 1 unit of savings. Let me show you this tile method again with a slightly different problem. Suppose this time I had negative 6 and I wanted to add to that 3 units. If I want to represent this situation using tiles, then I can start with a pile of 6 red squares to represent this negative 6. And I can start with a pile of 3 blue circles to represent this positive 3 that I am adding. And if I put those piles together, then the 3 blue circles and 3 of the red squares cancel each other out. So I'm left with just 3 red squares, and that represents a value of negative 3 units. So negative 3 would be the result of this addition. And this makes sense, right? Because if I start out 6 units in debt, and then I add a little bit of money to that, and I add 3 units of money to that, then I can pay off some of my debt, but not all of it, right? I'm still going to have a little bit of debt left, represented by this negative 3 here. Now, if you're dealing with really large numbers, it can also be nice to use a calculator to calculate these additions. So for example, suppose someone asked me to calculate the sum of 414 and negative 718. In this situation, I expect that I'm going to get a negative result from this, right? Because if I start with about $400 in my savings account, and then I take on a debt of about $700, overall, I'm going to be more in debt at the end because my debt is larger than what I have in savings. So I'm expecting a negative answer here in the end because I took on a debt that was more than the savings I had at the start. Let's figure out exactly how bad my situation is as a result of taking on this debt. First, I'll show you how to do this on just the standard Windows 11 calculator. Um, to do this calculation on the standard Windows 11 calculator, I would type in this expression almost exactly as it is written. So I would type in 414 plus, and then here are the parentheses. And then to type in negative 718, on the Windows calculator, it's a little funky. You have to type in the 718 first, and then you have to hit this plus minus button down here on the bottom of the calculator to make it a negative 718. Then close up the parentheses and hit enter. And so I get negative 304 from that. And that is about what I expected to happen, right? If I had a little bit of savings, about $400 of savings, and then I took on about $700 of debt, then I could use that $400 savings to pay down the bill a little bit, but I would still be left with a bill of about 300 bucks. And so that's what we're seeing here with this negative 304. Now let me also show you what this calculation looks like if you're using one of these old TI-83 or 84 calculators. On the TI-83-84 calculator, it's going to be almost the same as it was on the Windows calculator with two big differences. The first big difference is that the negate symbol is located in a different place. I'll type in 414 plus and then open the parentheses. And then I'm going to type the negate symbol, and it's located down here at the bottom right of the calculator. On the Texas Instrument, I'm going to type this symbol first, and then I'm going to type 718 after that, and then close those parentheses. Now, be careful to make sure that you are using this symbol in the bottom right when you're dealing with negative numbers. And do not use this symbol on the far right that you use for subtraction. If you try to use the subtraction button instead of the tiny make it negative button here in the bottom right, your calculator will give you a syntax error. So you can't do that. If you want to add a negative number, you have to use this little symbol here on the bottom right. So just be careful there. Now, something I want to point out that some of you may have noticed already is that adding a negative number has a really similar effect to subtracting a positive number. For example, 5 units, and I remove 3 from that pile. The result of that removal would be 2 units, right? If I have 5 objects in a pile, and then I just delete 3 of those, I'm left with 2 objects. So 5 subtract 3 results in 2. I get exactly the same result if I add the number negative 3, right? If I start out with 5 positive units and then I combine that with 3 negative units, then those 3 negative units cause 3 of those positive units to be canceled and deleted. I'm still left with exactly the same result, 2. So just bear that in mind, that adding a negative number has exactly the same outcome as subtracting the positive version of that number.